Back then it meant a lot to me because, like I was very nervous, because I didn't want the on the production.
Oh, no, just do it for me as this as a joke.
That's so silly.
All right, squeeze.
My cousin Brian went in with the best studio musicians in L.A. They called themselves the Wrecking Crew.
Brian Wilson is dead. The words hit with a kind of finality that not only closed a chapter in music history.
News Beach Boys legend Brian Wilson has passed away. We just got this news moments ago. The news was confirmed.
The morning of June 11th, 2025, brought confirmation that the co-founder of the Beach Boys, the man whose tortured genius created Pet Sounds, Smile, and a dozen other cultural milestones, had passed away quietly, under care, his memory fading, his body failing. The tributes came fast. Musicians from Paul McCartney to Billie Eilish voiced their admiration. Fans held candlelight vigils. Radio stations looped, "God Only Knows." But one voice was noticeably absent: Mike Love. For nearly 26 hours, the cousin who had stood beside Brian from the earliest garage rehearsals to the brightest stage lights said nothing. For decades, theirs had been a relationship marked by creation and collapse, by both harmony and fracture. But when Love did speak, finally, at the age of 84, the message was different. Stripped of defensiveness, of spin, of contracts and conflict, it was raw, it was simple, and it said what many had waited years to hear. I didn't just lose a colleague. I lost a brother. To understand why those words hit so hard, one has to go back to the very beginning, before the fame, before the lawsuits, before the tragedy. Mike Love and Brian Wilson weren't just bandmates, they were family. Growing up in Hawthorne, California, they were immersed in music, at church, at home, in the car. They sang together from the time they could talk. When they formed the Beach Boys in 1961 with Brian's brothers Carl and Dennis and their friend Al Jardine, no one could have imagined what they were about to set in motion. Their early hits like Surfin' Safari, Fun, 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 and I Get Around became synonymous with West Coast optimism and the clean-cut promise of 1960s America. Brian was the maestro, writing, arranging, producing. Mike was the voice and the frontman, giving the songs their edge and swagger. At first, it worked. Their roles complemented each other. But success has a way of testing every bond, and by the mid-1960s, the cracks were beginning to show. Brian's ambitions were growing more complex. He didn't just want to write pop songs, he wanted to craft symphonies, and that terrified Mike. By 1966, Brian Wilson had already withdrawn from touring to focus entirely on the studio. The result was Pet Sounds, a lush, introspective masterpiece that critics adored, but that left some in the band, especially Mike, bewildered. Love was reportedly concerned that the album was too experimental, too far removed from the upbeat beach image that had made them famous. Whether or not he actually said, "Don't mess with the formula," as legend has it, the sentiment stuck. When Brian began work on Smile, an even more ambitious and abstract project, tensions erupted. Mike thought it was self-indulgent and unmarketable. Brian, battling increasing mental health issues, crumbled under the pressure. The project was shelved, and the golden partnership began to dissolve. What followed were years of fragile reunions, diverging paths, and ultimately lawsuits. In 1992, Mike sued Brian over songwriting credits, claiming that Murray Wilson, Brian's father and the group's early manager, had left him off dozens of co-written songs. Mike won. The court awarded him $13 million. Legally justified or not, fans and critics saw it as betrayal. The public narrative shifted. Brian became the fragile genius, and Mike the greedy cousin who sued his way into the legacy. Yet the truth, as always, is more complicated. Brian Wilson was never an easy person to work with, not even in the early days. His mental health struggles were legendary. Periods of catatonic withdrawal, erratic behavior, heavy drug use, and controversial treatment under the control of Dr. Eugene Landy. Meanwhile, Mike Love carried the burden of keeping the Beach Boys brand alive. He toured relentlessly, navigated business decisions, and managed the band through decades when Brian was too unwell to perform. But that distinction, between the artistic and the commercial, became the source of endless tension. Fans saw Brian as the heart, and Mike as the suit. When Carl Wilson died of cancer in 1998, it should have been a moment for reflection and healing. Instead, it became the final fracture. Mike secured legal rights to the name The Beach Boys and continued to tour without Brian. Two versions of the band now existed, one led by Mike, one led by Brian. And fans were left to choose sides. The family was shattered. Publicly, they put on a few smiles, most notably during the band's 50th anniversary in 2012 when they reunited for an album and tour. But behind the scenes, the same old wounds still festered. The reunion was short-lived. Mike continued touring without Brian. Accusations flew. The cycle of fracture resumed. Even into the 2020s, the tension never fully abated. In 2020, Mike Love performed at a fundraiser for Donald Trump. Brian and Al Jardine immediately released a statement distancing themselves from the event, clarifying they had no part in it. Politics became another fault line in an already cracked foundation. Then came the long silence. Brian faded further from public view, placed under conservatorship as his cognitive health deteriorated. He made fewer appearances, rarely performed, and was largely shielded from the public eye. Mike Love, meanwhile, remained active, still performing with his version of the Beach Boys, and the divide continued, even as both men aged well into their 70s and 80s. In a rare 2024 interview with the BBC, Mike hinted that the two had seen each other again recently and that it wasn't as negative as people think. There was even hope, he said, that they might collaborate again, but time, as always, had other plans. Brian Wilson died in June 2025. No final tour, no last album, just a quiet passing, surrounded by legal guardians and distant echoes of a voice that had once shaped an era. And then, for the first time in years, Mike Love said something different. On the morning of June 12, 2025, a post appeared on Mike Love's official channels. A black-and-white photograph showed two boys, young Brian and young Mike, laughing, at Capitol Studios in 1965. The caption was short: "Death leaves a heartache no one can heal. Love leaves a memory no one can steal." Then came a short video. No dramatic music, no studio backdrop. Just Mike, in a black suit, holding that same photograph. "We didn't always agree," he said, his voice quieter than fans were used, too. "But what we created together is undeniable. I didn't just lose a colleague. I lost a brother." For fans who had grown up seeing Mike Love as the antagonist in Brian Wilson's myth, the video came as a surprise. It was direct. It was emotional. There was no blame, no rewriting of history, no justification, just acknowledgement. Love, for once, was not defending himself. He was remembering, and in that simple act, he did what decades of interviews, lawsuits, and comebacks had failed to do. He made people stop and listen. The reaction was immediate. Variety, NPR, Rolling Stone, and The Guardian all included Mike's statement in their coverage of Brian Wilson's passing. Some critics, long hostile to Love, noted that the tribute was perhaps the most honest thing Mike has ever said about Brian. Others remained skeptical, suggesting the statement came too late and only after there was no one left to argue back. Social media reflected this divide. Some fans reposted the tribute with captions like "finally" or "this means a lot." Others shared critical takes. Brian died alone, and Mike only spoke up now. But for the first time in years, the conversation wasn't about the lawsuit or the politics or the band name. It was about the bond that once was, about what had been created, what had been lost, and the difficult, quiet way that grief can sometimes soften even the hardest of hearts. Mike didn't attend the funeral as a speaker. He didn't make a spectacle, but he was there, confirmed by the Wilson family. No cameras, no stage, just a pew and an old Beach Boys song playing softly over the sound system. Don't talk, put your head on my shoulder. The other original members, Al Jardine, David Marks, Blondie Chaplin, were there too. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't an ending, but it was, maybe, a kind of peace. Now, as Mike Love enters his 84th year, he stands alone as the last living founding member of the Beach Boys. For decades, he has been cast in a role that is both deserved and misunderstood. The businessman who protected the band's name, the cousin who sued his own family, the man who kept singing long after the genius fell silent. But he was also there from the beginning, in the garage, in the studio, on the road. He was there when Brian was a bright-eyed kid with too many melodies in his head to sleep. And he was there at the end, holding a photo, trying to say what had never been said. Maybe that's all we can ask of anyone, not perfection, not reconciliation, just the courage to finally break the silence. He is the last surviving founding member of the Beach Boys. Dennis Wilson died in 1983. Carl Wilson passed in 1998. And now, in June 2025, Brian Wilson is gone too, taking with him over 60 years of musical history, genius, and pain. What remains is a complex, bittersweet silence. Mike Love is left standing, not just mourning a bandmate, but reflecting on a lifetime of public friction, private memories, and the legacy of a group that defined a generation. For decades, Love and Wilson were foils. Brian, the fragile, visionary genius who crafted symphonic pop out of teen dreams, and Mike, the more pragmatic frontman, seen by many as the corporate-minded cousin. But their story was never so simple. Love has long argued that the media mythologized Brian at the expense of the others. He didn't deny Brian's brilliance, he often praised it, but he also believed that his own contributions were dismissed, minimized, or even erased. "I may not be a genius," he once said, "but without me, a lot of the songs would never have been recorded. No one else would have sung them. No one else would have put them on stage." That quote, so defiant, so weary, sums up the quiet resentment that shadowed the band's later years. Mike Love wasn't trying to compete with Brian. He just didn't want to be cast as the villain in a story he helped build. And now, with Brian gone, he carries all of that weight alone. The spotlight, once shared by brothers and cousins, is colder and lonelier than ever. From a distance, it's easy to forget how much of the Beach Boys' success relied on collaboration, compromise, and tension. Behind the dreamy harmonies were business disputes, legal battles, and philosophical differences over what the band even meant. Brian wanted to create art. Mike wanted to keep making music people could dance to. When Brian spiraled into mental illness and drug dependency, Mike took over the touring side and kept the Beach Boys brand alive. But in doing so, he became a target, seen as profiting from his cousin's decline. The lawsuits in the 1990s only deepened that perception. Love sued Brian over songwriting credits, and though he won the case and the royalties, it cost him dearly. In public opinion, fans saw him as greedy. Biographers often cast him as the man who tried to tame genius. But the truth, as always, is messier. Love may have fought for money, but he also fought to keep the Beach Boys together, sometimes at great personal cost. He knew how to put on a show. He knew how to keep the band relevant when others might have let it fade. And for all the bitterness, he never walked away. He stayed. He sang. He showed up. That loyalty may not earn headlines, but it shaped the course of pop history in ways that are still felt today. After Brian's death, social media erupted with tributes, grief, and inevitable debates. While most celebrated Brian as a musical genius, Some turned their attention to Mike Love, his silence, his past, his place in the band's story. Some called him the last man standing, a figure who could now rewrite the history books as he pleased. Others were more skeptical. Was he trying to right old wrongs? Or was he retreating into the shadows, avoiding controversy now that there was no one left to contradict him? What became clear in those days of mourning was that Mike Love had reached a point of quiet acceptance. He didn't post long tributes or give tearful interviews. Instead, he shared a few words, a memory, a photo, a nod to the past, and then stepped back. He had no desire to dominate the moment. Perhaps it was respect. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Or maybe after so many years of conflict and noise, he understood that silence could say more than any speech. For once, he let Brian's voice echo louder than his own. But it wasn't always that way. In earlier years, Mike Love was far more vocal about the myths surrounding the Beach Boys. He pushed back against documentaries that he felt glorified Brian while ignoring everyone else. He reminded people that he co-wrote many of the band's biggest hits: California Girls, Good Vibrations, Fun, Fun, Fun. He insisted that without his drive, his voice, and his presence, those songs might never have reached the stage. And to be fair, he wasn't wrong. Brian may have written the music, but Mike sold it to the world. He performed tirelessly, touring even when the band fractured and fell apart. But the public wasn't interested in that side of the story. To them, Brian was the tortured artist, and Mike the company man. That dichotomy, however simplistic, stuck. And over the years, Love's efforts to correct it often came off as bitter or defensive. Only recently has that edge softened. In interviews from 2023 and 2024, he began to talk less about disputes and more about the early days, their childhood, their first recording sessions in the living room, those gigs where Brian didn't want to go but eventually showed up because Mike convinced him. These aren't grand revelations, but they are personal, human, and honest, and they show a side of Mike Love that's often hidden, the cousin, not the competitor, the memory keeper, not the myth breaker. Now, at 84, Mike Love is not trying to control the narrative anymore. He's simply surviving it. In many ways, he's a prisoner of perception, a man who, despite being present at every major milestone of the band's history, remains misunderstood. He doesn't fight it anymore. He doesn't post rebuttals or stage interventions. He just continues doing what he's always done, showing up, singing the songs, and letting time take its course. There's something poignant about that. Not everyone gets to outlive their own controversy. Fewer still get to watch their legacy evolve in real time. Mike Love's final chapter is being written not by him, but by a generation of fans, critics, and historians who now have the space to look back and see things more clearly. He's not rewriting history. He's just still here. The last witness to a lost legend. Brian Wilson's death doesn't just end a life, it ends an era. The Beach Boys were never just a band. They were a reflection of America's innocence, ambition, and eventual disillusionment. Their songs spoke to summers that never ended, but their story was one of personal winters, fractured relationships, and artistic heartbreak. Now, with Brian gone and Mike alone, the question of legacy becomes immediate. It's no longer about the past. It's about the present and what happens next. Brian's place in music history is secure. Albums like Pet Sounds and Smile shattered the boundaries of what pop music could be. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, celebrated in films, honored in tributes. His passing has been compared to that of John Lennon or David Bowie, a genius whose influence extended beyond his generation. But what of Mike Love? He was the voice on many of those hits, the keeper of the touring flame, the one who never let the brand die. And yet, he has rarely been celebrated. More often, he's been criticized for his legal fights, for his political views, for simply being the person who wasn't Brian. Even now, as he continues to tour under the Beach Boys' name, some see him not as the legacy's guardian, but as the one consuming it. That's a harsh view, and perhaps an unfair one. Still, Mike Love's story isn't finished. Legacy isn't a final stamp. It evolves, and maybe in these later years, with nothing left to prove, he will be seen differently, not as the antagonist of someone else's genius, but as a complex figure who helped bring that genius to life and who bore the burden of that responsibility longer than anyone. If this story has moved you, if the Beach Boys meant something to your youth, your family, or your love of music, consider sharing this video with others who feel the same. Subscribe to the channel for more untold music stories, the kind that honor not just the legends, but the lives behind them. And if you have memories or thoughts about Brian Wilson, Mike Love, or the Beach Boys, leave them in the comments. After all, in stories like this, the conversation never really ends. Thank you for watching.